A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. And hardly less marvelous has been the capacity of industry to design and of labor to operate the machines and methods to do things never done before. Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time. It is doubtful if such another combination could be got together in the world. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
I thought it appropriate to run that clip before we get started. 75 years. 75 years ago would be the Hiroshima bombing, as you heard there. So, just so happens to be today. So we'll get started here in just a few minutes. So the big challenge tonight is going to be making sure that I don't confuse this presentation with the next presentation, because the next presentation I've been working on today for work, and I have to give that presentation, I have to record it tomorrow so that it can be given next week, and then I have to rerun that presentation again the following week. So hopefully I don't start getting my slides all confused and things like that. The good thing is hopefully this time we won't have any technical difficulties. If so, I think this would be the first time, the first stream, where we do not have technical difficulties. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I think I'm a few minutes early, but we'll go ahead and get started. So this is one of the World War II commemoration presentations. It's, as I've said with the last one, this is one of the same presentations that I give for local libraries in town. So this was part of my job. This presentation is not part of my job, but composing this presentation was part of my job. And it just seemed kind of appropriate to try and smash in these last couple of presentations that we had in this series and get them put out in August, because August is a big month when it comes to World War II. So we are going to dive right into this. Now, the reason that one of the big struggles with this presentation is simply that when you're talking about large-scale battles or conflicts or anything like that, you're confined and constricted when it comes to time, the amount of time that you have to kind of push and compact everything into one solid space. Strategic bombing in the Pacific Theater, I mean, God, you could go back to 1931 if you wanted to. You could say that it started in 1931. You could say that it started in 1941, which I suppose you could say in the case of what we're looking at, it does. But it's really, really hard to tack down, but we're going to do the best that we can. I won't run this over. We're not going to exceed the normal amount of time, simply because sometime tonight I've got to take a break, and then I'm coming back later tonight. We're actually going to do another impromptu stream later on this evening. But to kind of put the Pacific Theater into perspective, you have to look at the actual Pacific Theater timeline. And this one is a lot kind of more all over the place than the European timeline, just because we had to kind of drag our heels in the Pacific Theater. A lot of the agreements that the Americans had with the European allies was simply that we had to take care of Europe first. We had to free up our allies in Europe first, and then turn around and start kicking at the Japanese. So a lot of the stuff that you see here at the beginning, you'll see where we're in the red, closer to 1941, and that's just because the Japanese are kicking our ass. As we get into later in 1942, they start to lose that grip, and really by 1943, they've really started to lose their grip. And then by the time that you get to later 1944, they're just in desperation. So we're not going to talk about every single one of these bits and pieces. That would be an extremely boring presentation, and I'm just not part of that life. But as we normally do, is we look at things from the CMH perspective, or the military history perspective, or West Point perspective, and this one right here is actually from West Point, that defines what those steps and phases are. And again, it's not something that you have to sit there and you have to look and you have to read. This is just one of those things where if we're recording it and we're presenting it, it's best just to have it linked in there. So phase 1 is kind of classified as the attacks on Pearl Harbor up through about June 1942. And it's basically marked by the Japanese just making their forward ingress. Then the Battle of Midway happens. And once you get to the Battle of Midway, things start to change. That is a major paradigm shift in the Pacific Theater. By the time you get to the second phase, nobody's really moving much of anywhere. By the time you get to the third phase, the Allies are on the offensive. And by the Allies, I mean mostly the Americans. There's some Canadian forces that are mixed in there too. There's Australian forces mixed in there, and there's New Zealand forces mixed in there. And in the meantime, the Chinese and the Indians are actually on mainland Asia, launching combat operations on the Asia mainland. And then when you get into phase 4, you're talking almost exclusively end of December 1944 into 1945. So you have the atomic bombs happen in there, Okinawa, Iwo Jima happen in there, and you have the surrender of Japan in there as well. So the important thing to look at when we look at this stuff is to take a look at the supply routes, the supply lines that we're actually dealing with, and where all these battles actually are taking place. So there's actually what's called the Joint Nat or the Joint National supply route, and it doesn't show on this map. It shows on the atomic bomb map, but it doesn't show on this one. The yellow line there actually shows where the Mesoamerica United States supply route runs. There's actually another line that should run up towards British Columbia, right off the islands there, and up towards up to Juneau, Alaska, and running further south, and that's actually the American-Canadian Joint Nat Supply Route. So there's actually a massive supply route that's coming in from North America down towards Australia and then up through Micronesia. And as you get into later 1944, 1945, they're using things like Hawaii, the Midway area. I don't believe we're yet using the Carolina Islands, but parts of the Marshall Islands are being used as well. So all these regions here are kind of being used for supply routes. Now, later in 1945, you're going to see attacks on Iwo Jima. You're going to see attacks on Okinawa. Formosa happens in 1944. And then there's also assaults in Burma that come much later, but the Allies are actually moving in on Burma as well as moving up through New Guinea. And there's going to be actual attacks that take place on mainland Japan within that time frame. But one of the key things that I've always wanted to point out whenever we show this map is that there are combat operations that happen in the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese attempt a landing in the Aleutian Islands. They fail, but actually you'll see that a little bit more on the next slide here. So the Japanese actually have 4 separate operations that take place up in the Aleutian Islands with the intent of taking the Aleutians, parts of southern Alaska, over towards British Columbia and possibly spilling down through the Pacific Northwest. That's the guess of what the intent was. Is that's how the Japanese were going to do an infiltration into North America. But you'll see there also there were American and Allied combat units that were situated up there that actually pushed back and repelled the Japanese from there. Now, a couple of things, though, here that we're really going to want to take a look at today is we're going to take a look at that Midway operation. One second. We're going to take a look at the Midway operation, which is MI, there in the middle. We're going to take a look at Downfall. Olympic, Coronet, and Majestic are the 3 components of Operation Downfall. We're going to take a brief look at Meeting House, and then the 2 centerboard operations are what we're going to take a look at as well. It wouldn't be right if we didn't take a look at Juneau and Iceberg, at least a little bit. Those are the Okinawa landings, but we're primarily going to be focused more on mainland Japan, and we're momentarily going to run through Micronesia as well. So just to take a look, these are the primary installations, Army airfields in the Pacific Theater. As some of you may or may not know, there's 3 separate theaters that make up the core of the Pacific Theater. So you have the Central Pacific operational area, the South Pacific, and the Southwest Pacific. Up until 2 years ago, all this was what was called PACOM, Pacific Command. Then I think that was Mattis's last thing that he actually kind of did that was a big deal. There was a realignment that reshaped all of this. One of the oldest commands in history, PACOM, got redesignated Indo-PACOM, and now that includes the Indian Ocean as well. But this is how PACOM originally would have looked. But the thing of it is that there's so many more airfields on all these islands than I can possibly shove into this map. So all the ones that you see outlined there, those are all Central Pacific OA PACOM installations. Even though there's a few that are in the South Pacific region, these are all um, Central OA installations. Now, the key ones that we're going to want to keep in mind is going to be Henderson Field there, the Hawaiian Islands. There's, of course, that's where the Pacific Operational Theater's HQ is. And then up towards Tinian, specifically, we're going to be looking at Northfield, and then the Ryukyu Islands, which includes Okinawa. So all of these locations are things that you'd be interested in, but those are the main ones that we're going to want to keep an eye on. Volcano Islands are in there too, but there's a bit of a problem, and we'll get into that with the Volcano Islands. They're just not big enough for what we need for what we're talking about today. So to kind of put this into perspective for you, what do the Americans have working for them? Well, in about 1939, 1940, there's a huge reorganization and modernization of aircraft, and it takes hold pretty much from about early 1941 onwards. So we were already in the process of doing this in 1941, before the Japanese attacked. So there's, we call them the cats, and that includes like the Wildcats. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of cat family aircraft. But the U.S. Navy also has one of its warbirds, which everybody knows and recognizes today as the F-4U Corsair. And then the U.S. Army sees large transitions to include the P-series aircraft, which P stands for patrol. So you'll see things like the P-40, P-37, P-39s, P-41s, 47s, and then eventually you'll see the P-51 that's like the one that's sitting on the tarmac down there. P-51 is probably one of the most iconic warbirds that still flies in some shape, way, or form today. But generally, the small single-engine aircraft were launched from carriers. They were light enough and able to get up in the air easy enough, so they launched them off of carriers. But a lot of the other means, part of the reason we were doing all the island hopping is because we could establish airstrips and small bases on those islands as a means to hopscotch with our not only our naval fleet, but also our aircraft. So that's generally what we did. But the problem with these is that the main range for these was between 350 and 800 miles. So something to keep in mind with that 800 miles is that 800 miles includes going both directions. So it's 400 miles one direction and 400 miles back. Now, if you've got an airfield on the other side of that 800 miles, you're fine. But if you don't, you're kind of screwed. So generally, when you see these ranges that they say, oh, it's 1,600 miles, it's 3,200 miles, and we'll see that later with the B-29s, it doesn't mean that's what its actual effective range was. It means that's how far it could fly before it just fell out of the sky. As for the bombers here, we transitioned away from these really boxy, bulky looking things over to B-17s, 24s, 25s, and 29s. All of the bombers, almost all the bombers in the Pacific are B-29s by 1945. There were no B-29s in the European theater. There was one B-29 that was sent over to, I think it was Northern England, and that was part of a disinformation campaign that they were running against the Germans to make them think that we were going to start shipping them over there. We never did. So there was one B-29 that sat on a runway, and that's all it did in Europe. But the rest of them were all shipped out to the Pacific theater. Medium-range bombers were used early in the Pacific War, so we saw them with the Doolittle raids. We saw them in the Battle of Midway. B-17s and B-24s were generally what those were. But by 1944, it's actually not the 299. I think it's the 335 model. The B-29 actually will start entering service, and you'll start seeing planes fly higher, faster, farther, carrying heavier payloads, and striking enemies being well out of the range of anti-aircraft fire. So generally, when you're looking at a map and you're trying to associate bombers with which theater, you'll see B-17s are more often seen in the European theater, and the B-29s are almost exclusively associated with the Pacific theater for that reason. Now, what did Japan have? Well, Japan did not invest much in the idea of having bombers deployed. They were very much get in, get out, move on. If we don't have planes that are heavily armed, we don't have planes that. What we have is quantity. We have a quantity of dive bombers and fighters and fighter attackers and things like that. The exception to this was the planes like the Lily, like you see over there on the right. And the Lily, the one that I'm actually showing here, is kind of a bastard. So the Lily that is shown here actually has a rocket that's strapped underneath it, and that is literally the extent of jet experimentation that the Japanese will do throughout the entire war. Fighter roles, I think everybody is familiar with the Zeros, and those were generally the ones that were used for the fighter or the patrol role. Torpedo dive bombers were what was known as Kate. Other dive bombers, they had the Val, and then their heavier bombers were the Lily, which, for the record, they had, if I'm remembering my numbers right, I believe between 60 and 80 Lily bombers. So it wasn't really something that they had plenty of. But a lot of times what you'll see is when you see depictions of Pearl Harbor or things like that, you'll hear people say, oh, that was a Zero that attacked Pearl Harbor. No, it actually, the Zeros were just the ones that were doing the strafing. There were no Zeros that were dropping bombs on Pearl Harbor because they did not have the external hard points to do so. All of them were extremely lightweight, but the problem is that the Japanese did not have they didn't have the ability to recreate anything that they lost. So if they lost something, they were kind of just screwed. They didn't have any way to actually mine for resources that were manufacture or reproduce anything that they had, so they were just kind of out of it. So as a result, you see them, moving into the islands. They're, growing the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They're enslaving pretty much everybody that they come across: the Koreans, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and even some of the Soviets that unfortunately got caught in the crossfire. They're going after all of these people. So that becomes a problem for them, and eventually that's what's going to drag them down and knock them out of the war, rather than just the fact that they're being met with overwhelming force. Now, what the Japanese do have, and they are extremely excellent at, is defending territory by terrain. So when we're dealing with things like Okinawa or Iwo Jima, or things like that, what you'll see a lot of is tunnel systems that are actually buried into the volcanic rock that's in the Pacific theater. You'll see artillery that's actually in caves being launched out of trapdoors that are in the ground, machine gun fire from situated machine guns, and then even enclosed anti-aircraft fire. So the Japanese were great at using the terrain to their own advantage. And indeed, that's the big thing that caused the most losses during a lot of these combat engagements, is that there was just so much that was going on, and the Americans were just not able to identify it. But the big thing is, from the air, you could attack mainland Japan, and almost all of those targets were soft. When you're attacking in the small islands in the Pacific theater, it's not quite the same way. It's hard volcanic ash. There's really not a lot that the Japanese are interested in protecting out there other than territory, potential slave labor. But in general, they're not really interested in defending that other than the fact that this is land and I'm going to defend this. So when you get to mainland Japan, their main mode of defense is anti-aircraft guns. So when we're dealing with the anti-aircraft defense systems, we're dealing with things like the Type 96 down here, which it was the most used anti-aircraft gun system that the Japanese were using. They had about over 20,000 units. They had some that would shoot up a little bit higher up in Kyushu, but they generally had really stagnant defensive measures that made open air bombing. It was easy to figure out exactly what the Japanese were going to do when it came to strategic bombing. So it was just something that it was very easy for them to actually figure out exactly what was going on here. And yes, Doughboy, I actually do know that the Mexicans were operating in the Pacific Theater. I mentioned that earlier. They were part of the. They were actually, a lot of them a part of the supply lines. Some of them made them into combat, but in general, at the time that most of the Mexican forces would have been involved, they were still largely recovering from. Really, they were actually recovering a lot from Mexican independence, but there were forces that did get sent out. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they were actually much more largely instrumental in getting shipment and supplies sent out at that time. So, to start things off, everybody pretty much knows about Pearl Harbor. I'm not going to sit here and beat around the bush with Pearl Harbor, but the response to Pearl Harbor is what I'll get at. So, America has to respond to this act of war somehow. They know that whatever they're going to do is not going to be something that's going to be a grand gesture or anything like that. So, what they do is they select one guy and they say, "Hey, you, what do you think? Can we do this?" And Doolittle actually says, "Yes, I do believe that we can do this." So he's getting situated. I'm remembering right. I think the installation that is involved with the Doolittle raid is an auxiliary that's off of Eglin Air Force Base today. It's one of their auxiliary fields, but they actually get an auxiliary field together out in the middle of nowhere in Florida off of Eglin Air Force Base, and they start doing dry testing of taking off and landing, literally based off of a painted line that's on the ground. And if you went over the line, you were in the water. That's generally how it is. There's a great movie out there about this too, and it's really historically accurate. But what basically happens is they're going to launch heavy bombers, or I guess they're medium bombers, but it's a bomber. It's got some weight to it. They're going to try and get this thing off of an aircraft carrier deck, 400 or so feet, and that's all that you've got to move. So it's one of those things where it's a feel-good story, kind of. It was a morale booster. So it was an objective victory for the United States. Did it really do much? It really didn't, but the idea of it was to say, hey, your mainland is vulnerable to us too. So that was the intent of the Doolittle raid. To kind of give you an idea, this is actually the layout of how the Doolittle raid was supposed to be, juxtaposed to kind of how it ended up. So they were discovered around 0820 on the day of the launch, and they have to pretty much scramble out further, and they have to launch their attack, and then they run out of fuel because they actually are discovered much further out than they intended. Now, if I'm remembering right, when I watched that terrible movie with Jason Hartnett and Ben Affleck and whatever the hell it is, and they injected all the terrible things in it, they made it out to seem like there was no real motion to get rid of the naval ship that was out there. There was. They actually waited until the ship was struck by gunfire and sunk before there was any kind of mode to launch any aircraft off the ship. And it was actually Doolittle that decided, yeah, we're going to go ahead and launch because, hey, I mean, they might already know that we're coming. But it really wasn't a matter of, well, shit, now what are we going to do? We're going to have to just kind of have to dump this out. It wasn't anything like that. So, yeah. So that Doughboy, what you're talking about is actually World War One. That's not World War Two. Um, the Zimmerman telegram is World War One. Oh, this also brings up another thing too. So most of the bombers actually make it down to Zhejiang. One of them actually moves up to the Soviet Union, lands, has his plane captured. He gets thrown in. He gets thrown into jail, pretty much. Him and his crew. But then after the war, the crew is returned, but the Soviets will actually keep the bomber, just simply because that's. Or did I say the Germans? I meant the Soviets. The Soviets will keep the bomber. Um, just that's how the Soviets basically handled their operations. So turning the tide, we use that term a lot at work, and the reason that we use turning the tide in the Pacific is simply because there was a definitive moment where the momentum kind of changes for the Japanese, and that is at the Battle of Midway. Now, when I'm talking about the Battle of Midway, there wasn't a lot that had to do with, well, actually, there was a lot to do with. So there were a lot of aircraft that were actually involved with staving off of the Japanese forces at Midway, but a lot of the actual precision strikes come off of smaller fighter bombers. So there were elements from the 22nd Bombardment Group and the 38th Bombardment Group that were both stationed on Midway at the time that the Japanese were planning to attack. Now, there were also some Vought devastators that were being sent that direction because the Americans were fully aware by this point that the Japanese were going to strike at Midway. So there were 3 carrier groups that were struck, and they lost all 3 of those aircraft carriers. The Japanese did. The Americans did lose an aircraft carrier in the combat, but the big difference that we always point to is that the Americans are able to replace that combat materiel. The Japanese are not, and they never will. So once a carrier is taken out of commission for the Japanese, that's a carrier that's totally gone. And in the meantime, when they're also losing aircraft, they're losing manpower and pilot experience that they're never going to get back. Because if they're going down over enemy territory, those Japanese soldiers are getting captured. They're not being sent back. Either that or they're killing themselves because Bushido Code says you don't get captured, you just commit suicide. So there were still about 307 Allied casualties. 304 were actually during the battle. But one of the things that we did is we launched B-17s and B-26s to go out and attempt to bomb the Hiryus, the Hiryu, which was a Japanese aircraft carrier. And that's actually a picture of B-17 bombers attempting to strike the Hiryu. And you'll see that not a single one of them actually hit their target. And that indeed was the case. None of the heavy bombers actually struck a target. All of them were pretty much any carriers that were sunk and actually struck by American forces were generally devastators. It was smaller aircraft. It was not the larger bombers. And so for Midway, this was kind of the layout for the Battle of Midway, is that they had B-26 support that was coming in from Hawaii. They had them moved there ahead of the battle. They had the carrier strike groups that were situated just to the north and east of Midway. And the thing of it is that General Nagumo, who's commanding the Japanese Navy, is thinking that there's 2 aircraft carriers that are actually in that group are much further north. They think that they're actually moving up towards Alaska, and instead they're actually right here. So that was, and you can see down here on the bottom actually where this combat kind of lays out. You'll see all these little zigzags that are down here in blue. That's where B-17s are actually launching strikes and attacks on the Japanese forces. And again, none of those result in any kind of sinking of any ships, but it's what comes off of the Yorktown, strikes off the Yorktown, and strikes off the Enterprise and Hornet. Those are where we actually start to see aircraft being sunk. And you'll see they'll take down 3, and then they'll actually go back out and they'll get this 4th one just before it leaves the combat area. So it's a big win because when we talk about strategic and strategic policy and force projection, I can talk. When we talk about that in the Pacific Theater, force projection is everything. You don't project force with an air force. You don't project force with just a guy standing somewhere. You project it by having some kind of a base installation that'll help you move. And aircraft carriers are essentially their own operational base. If all you have is a battleship, like the Germans did, you don't have you don't have a way to project that force. You're not going to conduct a landing with just a battleship. You can conduct a landing with aircraft carriers. You can conduct air superiority policy with aircraft carriers. It just kind of, it's a give and take thing. And the Germans never get it. The Japanese get it. They just don't have a way to reconcile when they've actually lost. So again, this is another one of those things that I'm not going to make everybody read, but one of the things that was really interesting is that when I was creating this presentation back in June, McConnell Air Force Base actually put together a fantastic write-up on the 22nd Bombardment Group at Midway. And basically, the 22nd Bombardment Group was the one that was handling all the B-26s, all the Marauders, and then a lot of the Devastators. So it was really kind of interesting to read through this and see what they had to say. Now, they're making it sound like the B-26s did more than they actually did. I'm going to be upfront about that. But the Marauders that they had there, the VT-8s combat group, those groups were actually extremely instrumental in sinking of Japanese ships. So if you ever feel interested, go out there, take a look at this. It's actually a pretty good write-up if you can take it with just a little tiny bit of salt. But it is pretty good. And that leads me also to the Sunsetters. And as far as what we're dealing with when it comes to taking a look at things around in the rest of the Pacific Theater, I typically will look at the Sunsetter Group, the 38th Bombardment Group, simply because they're working their way through Papua New Guinea. They're working their way up through Micronesia. They're working their way up in all these areas that are largely just not talked about in the Pacific Theater at all. So I tend to look at them. So in 1943, they were primarily focused on softening up targets in Indonesia, but the highest bulk of asset loss actually came from the terrain. So the terrain was as such so that if you land on it, your plane will actually start sinking into the substrate that's underneath. So a lot of the terrain losses are coming from that, or it's from shock damage. So when you're landing, it's actually so bumpy that it causes problems in the actual structure of the aircraft. So that's where most of the problems with operating in New Guinea and places down in the southern portion of Micronesia comes from. Most strikes after airfield purges were ineffective due to the tunnel systems, and that's true generally of any place in the Pacific Theater. So there was early warning bombardment for Iwo Jima. It didn't do shit. The same thing was true for Papua New Guinea. So by 1945, they're looking mainly to shift things towards the Philippines and then get ready for Olympic. Because by the time you're getting to 1945, you're starting to have to plan for, okay, well, the big day's coming. We need to be ready for it. And the 38th was instrumental in making sure that they were prepared and ready to actually execute. So now the next big thing, and I've talked about this a number of times before, because where most of the destruction of Japan comes from does not come from the atomic bombs. That's not where the bulk of destruction comes from. It's where the bulk of destruction could have come from had the war continued at its pace. But it wasn't. The Japanese surrender, 15 August, and that's the end of it, at 2 bombs. This, by far, is much more devastating than the atomic bombs. So there's air raids on industry, shelter, residential spaces, industry, oil refineries, military headquarters, installations, ammo dumps, places like that. Just the list goes on. And they're not carrying out simple bombing operations. They are out to destroy, break Japan, top down. So most of these strikes, just because of the limitations of how far the Americans can actually fly out, are centered mostly on Honshu and Kyushu. Um, and they mainly used incendiaries. Now, the material that is being used for most Japanese construction at the time is extremely flammable. Basically, think of it as industrial paper of sorts. So you have one house catch on fire or one building catch on fire, the one next to it's going to go up, and then the one next to it's going to go up, and then the one next to that's going to go up. And it's going to keep on doing that until it encounters something that is not quite as flammable. And by that time, it's just out of control. So it's something that it's something that's extremely controversial, and it still is today, is that the firebombing actually did much more damage than the atomic bombs did. So the thriving industrial center, like it says here, would be crippled without people around it. Buildings were especially prone to catching fire. Perceptive risk of civilians being hostile towards Allied personnel, and strikes on the homeland might increase pressure on the empire. So the Americans were under the assumption at this time that if they could break the psyche of the average Japanese citizen, they could do the most damage. And what's the way that you can totally break down the psyche? Totally obliterate what they know, what they see around them, the things that they called home, their livelihoods, everything. If they could break that, the sooner they break it, the less fighting there's going to have to be. So that is what the Americans are launching. And most strikes originate from China up through 1943, but it shifted to include the Philippines and the Marianas by 1944. 1945, you'll start to see the volcano islands get included in this, and you'll start to see Okinawa by the end of June. Actually, the last Japanese soldier gets captured. There's already Corps of Engineer guys on the islands with hammers and shit just working on trying to get the airfield set up at Okinawa. Literally the same day that they had totally annihilated any kind of resistance. So LeMay, who's commanding the Army Air Force at this time, also decides that we don't really have all that great of air cover and support, so we're going to switch to nighttime bombing raids to help alleviate that just a little bit, because if you can't see your target, it makes things a little bit harder. This is also a good one, and it's worth bringing up. Estimates in Tokyo alone put casualty rate up to 100,000 off of the firebombing. To put that into perspective for you, the upper end of the atomic bomb blast was 80,000. And just by how much we actually destroyed of Tokyo, it didn't even start to look like normal until the mid to late 1950s. So, yeah, take that for what you will. The other key thing to keep in mind is that if it was a city that had military significance, we were going to level that city. Just because we knew that the risk was high, that if you are in an area that has military presence, you're probably more tied into the military function. So they had plenty of air raids, and generally the air raids are happening at the same time as other operations in the Pacific Theater. So when Okinawa is going on, they are launching airstrikes on mainland Japan at the same time. Iwo Jima launching airstrikes. When they're going into Leyte and things like that in the Philippines, they are launching airstrikes into Japan. And this is all part of A, diversion, and B, saying, hey, we can get you on multiple fronts. You have no place to hide from the Americans. And so that was the general gist of it in this case. Now, I mentioned this when I did my combined bomber offensive, my strategic bombing campaign in Europe, is that what you have to remember about 1944, 1945 bomb sites is that you can be a mile off your target and still have it be counted as a hit. Having accuracy is not something that really came natural to anybody anywhere. I mean, this was true for the Germans, it was true for the British, it was true for the Americans, it was true for the Soviets, it was true for everybody. Just bomb sites were not that good. So you could have a 1 mile hit, you could have a 3 mile hit. If you were at a 4 mile, I think actually no, if you were at a 5 mile hit, that was called a near miss at 5 miles. I would just love to be able to go out to the range and be off by like 500 feet and have that be called as a bullseye, but okay. And a miss was at 7 miles. So as you get into 1945, they condensed that a little bit. So it's a half a mile, you've got a hit. 1.5 mile, you've got a hit. 3 miles, you're at a near miss. And then as you get a little bit closer, once you get into like Korea War, you start seeing things like the B-52s that are up there, and you start seeing guided precision bombs come into play. Your miss is at 500 feet. Your hit is at 250 feet. And then, of course, now we have radar guided anything. So, I mean, your hit is like 5 feet. But at this time, we're talking about miles. So that was the big problem there. The thing, though, that we didn't have an issue with is large formations of enemy aircraft coming out to intercept bombers. We had stationary targets. Most of the escort aircraft that were out there flying were mitigated because of the P-51 escorts. P-51s were faster, they could fly higher, they carried more, they had a ton more armor on them. So it was just a matter of we had better technology. And LeMay started actually getting into this point where he was also saying the same thing that you're saying in there, Zach. 5 miles is ridiculous. So we're going to lower our bombing altitudes, and we're going to switch over all to nighttime bombing. The problem with this is that once you are identified, you are within altitude of anti-aircraft fire. So we started to see a little bit more of a loss of B-29s by the time LeMay makes that decision. So 2.2 million total casualties estimated by the end of the war by strategic bombing on the home islands. That's just by firebombing. We're not counting the amount of homelessness that's involved either. So one of the things that I like to make sure that I convey when I'm talking about these things is that the atomic bombs were bad. Nobody's going to deny that. However, they did not do as much damage as the firebombing campaigns did. They did not do as much damage as we were about to do either. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. So to kind of give you an idea, this is a look at the percentage of a selection of cities that were destroyed. So this is Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Kawasaki over towards Yokohama and Tokyo. Yeah, I can say Tokyo. Now, these are just a selection of cities. There were 7 cities that were totally wiped off the map. 99%. 99%. 99. Of those 7, not a single one was struck by atomic bomb. I'm just going to throw that out there. So after the Battle of Okinawa, and I've got a modern picture in there, and I'll explain that here in a minute. Okinawa was selected as the primary step-off point for any large-scale land invasion of Japan. The nice thing about Okinawa was that the main island actually extended the operational range for the B-29 to put all of Japan in range. We could fly over Japan. We could make it as far north as Hokkaido. Um, so Okinawa was extremely appealing for that reason. But the thing of it is that when the Japanese surrendered in mid-August, we're still working on a base in Okinawa. Um, and by that time, I was like, well, I guess we don't need to rush this to get it done. But the installation that they were building on Okinawa was, I'm going to preface this by saying it's not anymore. At the time, it was the state of the art installation. So state of the art, in fact, that we are still using that installation today. So we had limited bombing missions that were launched from Okinawa in July, but most of the bomber operations that were launched from Okinawa actually were involved with the Korean War. So a lot of B-52s and B-58s flying out of Kadena Air Force Base, as it's known today. The B-29 bases on Okinawa were eventually converted to carry those B-52s, and the nuclear strike packages were scheduled to be moved from Tinian to Okinawa ahead of the invasion. Now, that's not the strike packages that are actually going to be dropped on Japan. That is additional strike packages that were being lined up in preparation for Operation Downfall. But by the time of 1955, all of the strike packs that we have for the Asian theater, primarily Eastern Russia, North Korea, Communist China, places like that, they are all on Okinawa by 1955. And today, actually, we do have multiple squadrons of fighters and bombers that are situated on Okinawa as part of the security reassurance policy that we have with the Japanese military and the Japanese government. That is not set to expire. It's one of the things that it's one of those allied strengthening things. And the U.S. has a guarantee to that, just like the Japanese has a guarantee to it. So the Japanese also use Kadena Air Force Base as well as the Americans. But the main place of interest is not Okinawa. Okinawa is important for something that we'll talk about when we actually talk about the nuclear bombs. But it's Tinian. Tinian is actually the place that is the most important in the Marianas. So it was originally occupied by Japan until 1944. It was previously an asset of Spain and then Germany, because, why not Germany? And then the Germans get their asses kicked by Japan in World War I, and Japan decides to take everything that they can possibly get their hands on. But then they got a little bit too greedy. They spit on us in Hawaii, and then we flew over and kicked their ass in 1944. But they established Ushi Point Airfield in 1939. And we see this airfield, and that's actually the airfield that's still being used. But Americans take Tinian on 24 July 1944, and they launched that campaign via Saipan. Now, as soon as this is the same thing as Okinawa, as soon as the Americans have their victory, they're going to start working on Tinian North Field. It was to operate exclusively as a B-29 installation. So there's 4 main runways that you can see in that lower picture there that run east-west. And it could house as many as 265 B-29s. It was 1,500 miles from Kyushu and the remainder of the Japanese home islands. It didn't quite have the range to put Hokkaido in the Corsairs, but it did have the range to put Tokyo in the strike zone. So the ideal operational range for the B-29 was at 1,620 miles for comparison. So Tinian was a very, very appealing target. So the B-29s that are going to take off and deliver the atomic payload to Japan are stationed on Tinian. They're going to rendezvous at Iwo Jima, and then they're going to make their way to their targets. And just to kind of give you an idea here at the lower right, so you have Tinian down there at the bottom, Okinawa, so you can kind of see why Okinawa was such a big deal to the Allies. Tokyo is at the very north edge of Tinian's operational space, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki are also both at the far north of Tinian's operational space. Now, while I'm not going to go way into the atomic bombs, it's part of strategic bombing in the theater. Next presentation, I'll actually talk about the atomic bombs a little bit more, but it's worth noting that they are part of the strategic bombing campaign. So the Enola Gay, which is pictured to the left, and the Boxcar, which are pictured to the right, are the main bombers that are associated with striking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. They were both what were called saddle tree modifications. Originally, that was called Silver Plate. Silver Plate was the code name that was assigned to the B-29 program, Block 36. Colonel Tibbets actually went to the plant up in Omaha, and he picked each one of the Silver Plate B-29s off the assembly line himself, and all those B-29s were supposed to be used in the Manhattan Project. So that's all that they were used for. Now, the thing of it is that everybody always thinks, well, it was the Enola Gay and the Boxcar, and that's really the big deal. Hardly anybody even talks about the Boxcar. It's not true. Those B-29s were never in the air alone. There was always multiple B-29s in the airspace. So, for example, on the 75th anniversary here of Hiroshima, there are actually 7 B-29s that were involved with the atomic bombing of Japan. Straight Flush was one of them. Jabbit 3, Full House, the Enola Gay had the deployment. Keeping in mind, Straight Flush was doing the weather control for Hiroshima. Jabbit 3 was hovering over Kokura, which was the alternative first choice. Full House was over Nagasaki. Great Artiste was in charge of doing measurements of the atomic deployment. Necessary Evil was taking care of photography. And Top Secret was what was called a Strike Pack Spare. Now, a Strike Pack Spare basically means that if for some reason the main aircraft was not area to carry out the deployment, then the Strike Spare would actually be the one to deliver the bomb to the destination. So if something was wrong on the runway with Enola Gay, Top Secret would be the one to carry the bomb. Same thing on 9 August. So Enola Gay was in the air once again, doing weather control over Kokura. Lagan Dragon was over Nagasaki. Boxcar was in charge of actually deploying the bomb. The interesting thing about Boxcar is that its crew was flying the Great Artiste, and the Great Artiste's crew was flying the Boxcar. Yeah, I don't know. Those silly Air Force guys, I tell you. So Great Artiste was carrying measurements. Big Stink was doing photography, and Full House was the Strike Pack Spare that time. The Japanese air defenses came close to reaching the B-29s, but they just couldn't reach. It was just beyond the Kokura defensive altitudes by 2,500 feet or so. So they just couldn't get them struck down, and it was a much smaller formation, so it really kind of threw the Japanese off. Why are they only launching 7 bombers? This doesn't make any sense. But we all know the results of those 13 sorties of the B-29s. Interesting thing, though, Boxcar should have actually cycled out its package to Full House. Boxcar had mechanical failure before it took off, but they were running behind. At least this is how the story goes. They were running behind, so they went ahead with the strike pack as it was. And Boxcar actually has to make an emergency landing on the day of the strike after the bomb is deployed at Okinawa. If they had missed the runway, and this is coming out of the memoirs, if they had missed the runway, it would have been a crashed landing and they would have lost the aircraft. So Okinawa coming in clutch there. Now, what happens if we didn't use the bomb? This gets into ethics just a little bit. You remember this. We talked about this. There's an ethical dilemma that comes up with the nuclear bombs always. And it comes up mainly because we are on this side of the nuclear bomb. And that's simply that it was awful. There was no reason we should have used it. This is terrible. Total loss of life. We could have done something different. We had a plan for something different. We were planning on doing something different. It just never happened, thankfully. Why do I say thankfully? Because the amount of loss that would have mounted if we hadn't used the bomb was much greater than what it was when we did use the bomb. So I'm going to read this verbatim because actually I think I laid this out pretty good when I built this presentation. So downfall was planned to kick off with Operation Olympic on 1 November 1945. So this is much later. This is after a third bomb would have been deployed. Would have consisted of the largest massive force ever seen. As you heard at the beginning of the presentation, President Truman was there saying, hey, there's ships ready to go. We're ready to fight you tonight. 42 aircraft carriers, 4 fleets, 5 air forces, in addition to an auxiliary British force, 6 million projected landing forces, and that does not include supplemental forces that would be following up from the rear, nor does it include the Soviet forces that were expected to come in from Hokkaido, which amounted to about 13 million forces, a total of 19 million landing on D-Day, which would have been 1 November 1945, as I said. Olympic attack would strike airfields and depots in Kyushu. Coronet focused on Honshu and planned invasion of Tokyo. Soviet Union, as I said there, was tasked on the assault of Hokkaido. Intel reported about 2,500 aircraft in the IJAAF, a number that was erroneous. We found out that there was about 10,000 at the time of surrender, which is more than just a little bit of a decimal point error, if you ask me. Somebody didn't do math. Math. Terrible subject. We should burn it. See, because numbers like this are exactly why we shouldn't have math. Anyway, tactical nuclear strikes, up to 7, were authorized and planned for. So we were going to actually detonate nuclear bombs on the battlefield and then rush in behind the nuclear detonations at the Japanese. So we were still going to use at least another 7 after the one that we didn't use after Nagasaki. Allied command assessed over 4 million IJF warfighters were in the region, plus accounted for an additional 31 million count of civilian resistance. If you remember, I mentioned Bushido at the beginning of the presentation. The reason I mentioned that is because, correctly so, the Americans were under the impression that the Japanese were going to fight us. And they were. They were going to actually... we were fully aware that while the Japanese didn't like what was going on with the Japanese government, they would rather fight the Americans than fight their own government. So they were counted as combatants. 35 million combatants. Total combatant engagement totals were estimated to be over 40 million, with a casualty rate of over 30% across all combatants. So 30% of that 40 million were expected to be casualties by the end of 1946. Operational planning was canceled on 15 August 1945, which means after the atomic bombs were used, we were still planning on actually invading Japan with this operational plan. But we didn't, thankfully. The plans for the third bomb were already in place on 26 July. That bomb was delivered on 11 August. It was somebody who said at the last minute, hey, the president wants to be the one that actually says whether or not we're using this thing a third time. That's the only thing that kind of saved it. The Japanese enter peace negotiations on 10 August. It kind of goes back and forth. By the 13th, we're aware that they're actually serious, but we're still keeping bombing campaigns running on the Japanese because we want them to know that we're serious. Before any aircraft on Okinawa were activated, though Japan surrendered. So, I mean, the base was active, but the aircraft really were not. Doolittle actually held back the entire 8th Air Force in Okinawa because he was convinced the Japanese were not going to take the olive branch that was actually being handed to them because Truman was basically just pleading with Hirohito at that point, please surrender, don't make me actually have to sign this paper. Recon and early warnings operations continued over Japan well into the late 1945 time period. The large formations observed on 2 September were the last war state formations over Japan, though, because by 2 September, we had it. It was done. There was no need for there to be any combat operations over Japan, and the Americans basically wrapped it up, left. That's to say that there was an occupying force, but we didn't need to have any air combat formations in Japan at that point. So, you remember seeing that map with all the all over the screen, showing where all of the operations were. This is a more complete map of where all of the operations were. It's still incomplete. I see like 3 that are missing on this map, but somebody actually put a lot of time in this. It was not me. I'll tell you that right now. But so what did it all cost? What did it all save? So the absolute figures for the Pacific Theater are much more skewed and fragmented than the European theater, just because we had Japanese surrendering in 1970 still. So it's really kind of weird how all that kind of worked out. Estimations and figures from specific events and battles, but the exact figure is still debatable, especially for the atomic blast, just because we were dealing with radiation poisoning, cancer, things like that, all needed to be considered and factored in. Ballpark estimates for potential casualty rates for operations that never occurred, and figures for percentages of cities that were destroyed. So to put that in mind, because I didn't actually give you any numbers earlier, so Pearl Harbor had 3,600 American casualties and 65 Japanese casualties. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima had 12 American casualties and between 90,000 and 126,000 Japanese casualties. Casualties, by the way, mean wounded, KIA, MIA, or captured. Nagasaki didn't have any American casualties, but had up to 81,000 Japanese casualties. But the cumulative air raids on Japan had between 454,000 and 2.1 million Japanese casualties. Again, lots more casualties came out of the air raids on Japan than the simple atomic bombs did. City destruction ranged anywhere from 11.9% all the way up to 99%. Like I said, yeah, 99%. Ugh. Homelessness rates in Japan exceeded 8 million by the end of 1945. Some estimates had it as high as 12 million people were without homes. Now, here's the thing. So I told you a 30% casualty rate for downfall. I'm going to put that into numbers for you. Downfall invasion estimates by 1947 suggested casualty ratios of 3 to 1, equating to over 12,500,000 casualties, with up to 19 million across the entire theater. That is to say, they were expecting by 1947 for 19 million people to be dead if they didn't surrender at the 2 atomic bombs. That was the estimate. Now, to put that into some perspective for you, the 12,500,000 figure came from the Japanese. The Japanese came up with that figure. The Americans came up with the 19 million figure. So even the Japanese recognized that as an issue. Japan remained in a total state of disrepair for the remainder of the 1940s. It wasn't until the 1950s, when the U.S. actually began getting involved with the rebuilding, that Japan actually restores itself in any shape, way, or form. The Army Air Force remains the only operational wing of the U.S. military to have ever deployed an atomic bomb in combat. It also remains the only force in the world to do so. The B-29s remained in service through the Korean War. Interestingly enough, the Fat Man and Little Boy bombs remained both in service through about 1950. So we were using those actively through about 1950 in some shape, way, or form. But an interesting thing here is that as of this year, the Japanese population has sued the Japanese government at least 4 times for instigating and failing to seek peace treaties with the U.S. So the Japanese mostly hold their own government accountable for the bombing techniques. And we will actually take a look at that in the next presentation that we do as to why that was the case. I actually just read an article that there's some sensitive notions in the Japanese that they hold the U.S. accountable or things like that. That is mostly a myth. It's mostly a myth that the Japanese actually hold the U.S. Totally accountable. That's not to say that they don't blame them in some shape, way, or form. It's to say that they recognize that the government of Japan, the imperial government of Japan, had more to do with it probably than the Americans did, because the Japanese were just provoking the Americans at every turn. With that being said, this was a great quote here. The peak of the bombing campaign in 1945 was unrivaled in the annals of human slaughter. That was actually spoken by John Keegan. I can do that. There are some good resources out there. I kind of threw this together really quick. This isn't where I got all of my information. There's so much more, but it's one of those things where you just try and throw a few things together and hope that people are paying attention. I've got a couple of articles that I've written up on it. The Atomic Bombing of Japan article that went out on the 15th of July, that is an actual publication. The Boxcar article that went out on the 25th, that was a for funsies article. You can check out both of those to get some information on them. Now, the one last thing I'll throw out there before I wrap this all up is that we do have a presentation on 20th of August. That is on the atomic bombing of Japan and the end of the war. That's the one that I actually have to record for tomorrow. And then there's a couple of cool new ones that I'm doing on lost history. So the first one is on Atomic Annie and the triple threat weapon, which I might have to scrap due to information that I received earlier today. The other one is the Atomic Age, the evolution of nuclear deterrence in the Cold War, which includes a couple of slides on one of my favorite horror pieces of the Cold War, which is known as the Flying Crowbar. We're going to have a couple of pieces in there on that, some stuff that I pulled off of DTIC, so you'll actually get to see some of the spooky things that come out of that. There will be a modification, though, to the Let's Play schedules. I just received word that Genshin Impact has been given a release window, and that release window is sometime in like the next 2 or 3 months. So there will be a modification as soon as I know when that window is to the tail streams. I will be removing one of the days and replacing it with Genshin Impact. Also, there will be a impromptu stream here in about an hour for Ace Combat as well. So I'll be doing that right here on this channel in about 55 minutes or so. So hope you'll all come running back for that. In the meantime, that'll do it for the official presentations. And we will do strategic bombing, or no, not strategic bombing. See, this is where my mind is today. We'll do the atom bomb and the end of the war next time. We'll see you around.